This is the second lecture of this series of identifying sentence modifiers. In the first lecture, we sort of talked in general terms about what sentence modifiers are, and also I gave you an overview of the kinds of things, the kinds of elements that begin sentence modifiers. So now we're going to have some more practice in identifying sentence modifiers. So this is what we saw before. A sentence modifier is any phrase that gives us more information about what is happening in the independent clause. So we looked in detail at dependent clauses and prepositional phrases, and we saw some examples of them. We've seen dependent clauses before. So the dependent clauses tend to give the conditions under which the event in which the independent clause would, could, will, and or already did take place. So here's an example. The dependent clause starts with an as. And as we said before, the subordinating conjunctions are really the only difference between, they're the only thing that makes a dependent clause dependent. Otherwise, they look exactly the same as an independent clause. They have a tensed verb and they have a subject. So hopefully by now you've got dependent clauses. Prepositional phrases describe when or where the event in the independent clause took place, in time or in space. So, one example, on many blocks, upper floors jut precariously over the sidewalk. And then, so that's a pretty concrete sort of spatial thing. The second example is a more sort of abstract placement. So under a program financed with more than $800 million in loans. This is a prepositional phrase again. Under is a preposition. Clearly you'll find it on your lists. But prepositions are one of the things that non-native speakers of English have the most trouble with, because there are many prepositions, a lot more than in a lot of languages. And, you know, there's no sort of logical reasons why you should be under a program rather than in a program or as part of a program or something like that. It's just the way it is. So the only thing that you have to do is, if in doubt, look the word up either on your list, or if you can't find it on your list, look it up in a dictionary. So these are the other sentence modifiers that we looked at: participial phrases, infinitival phrases, and adverbial phrases. They give extra information about how the event in the independent clause took place, or is taking place, or will take place, or it gives some information about the author's attitude. So let's take a look at some examples. Participial phrases. We're starting with the present participle phrase. These are the ones that start with the ing verb, or the verb kind of thing ending in ing. I'll let you read those little bits. I want to go straight to the example. And you see here that we have a participial phrase that's after the independent clause. And I haven't done it in these slides, but you should always be identifying subjects and verbs first. Because if you find the independent clauses, then you can ask yourself the question quite easily, okay, so what is all the other stuff that isn't an independent clause? So the participial phrase that we see here is setting them up for disaster of a scope that could in some cases surpass the devastation in Haiti from last month's earthquake. So setting here, or setting up, is the present participle. We see set is a verb. You could look that up in a dictionary if you are unsure. And it ends in ing, so we know it's a present participle. And it's just after the comma. So we know we're not looking at a tensed verb here, because there's no auxiliary before it. Here's another example. Just assume that I found the verbs in the main clause. That we said and might be. So the participial phrase here is echoing other engineers and planners trying to reduce Istanbul's vulnerability. And so it follows the same form. What we're doing here is really not that complicated. You're looking at the beginning of a clause, a beginning of a sentence, and you're locating the commas. Of course, as I said in the previous lecture, the commas are always going to tell you where things begin and end. Okay, let's move on to past participle phrases. They begin with past participles, which are main verbs ending with ed or en, and whether it's ed or en is not predictable. You just have to learn it. And if in doubt, look it up. Dictionaries are very helpful. Big dictionaries, not teeny tiny dictionaries. So again, it gives information about surrounding conditions, and this is true of present participial phrases as well. They give you more information about the subject and the verb of the independent clause, and there's a long reason for this, but basically it's like they have an implicit subject, and so they sort of borrow a subject from the independent clause. If the subjects don't match, like if you can't infer that they're about the same thing, you've got what's called a dangling modifier. You might have heard of that. I think I talk about it later, and it's certainly in your textbook. Anyway, subjects sort of match. So here the thing we have given is the past participle. And once again, it's just characteristic. You've got a main verb with an en ending, comes after the comma, introduces a whole lot of information, and there's no it's not a clause. And you may see tensed verbs and all sorts of things. I think you will find that the tensed verbs are modifiers on nouns, and that's what we're going to look at in the next lecture. But that's just to give you a heads up that even if you see a tensed verb, it may not be in an independent clause. Probably not. Okay. These participles are tricky because they can occur in 3 different environments. They can occur after an auxiliary verb. That's what we saw in the first week. So I'm carrying my bag. I had carried my bag. These are independent clauses. They can occur at the beginning of a participial phrase. Carrying my bag. I strode into the office. Asked about my excellent bag. I responded quickly. These are both participial phrases. We see that there's no tensed verb. They can also modify a noun phrase. The woman carrying her bag. That's sort of an abbreviation of the woman who was carrying her bag. Once again, you've got to be careful. Really, these participial phrases that we're looking at, they're only going to be right at the beginning of a chunk of text. They're not going to be preceded by anything. As in the examples we see here. If you see a participial phrase preceded by a noun phrase or an independent clause, or something you think is a participial phrase, or got a subject or an auxiliary or something like that, look carefully to see what it's doing. It will be doing one of these 3 things. It's your job to figure out which one. And this is another trick. Ing verbs can also act as nouns, and we saw that in one of the quizzes. A sentence like, running makes my head hurt. So we're treating running as a thing rather than an action. They're called gerunds in that case. Just this is for completeness. I'm not going to be asking you questions about gerunds, though I'm sure you've had to identify some gerunds in subject positions. So this example in the 3rd bullet point, that's a gerund. They can occur at the beginning of sentences, so that's why you always should start looking for your tensed verb. Because sometimes they can be the subject, as we see here. Okay, so be careful to look at the surrounding environment to make sure you're dealing with a participial phrase which modifies a sentence. And we're getting to things that modify nouns, but I introduced them here just so you know that not everything that looks like a participial phrase is a participial phrase. Let's move on. Infinitival phrases. As we said before, infinitive phrases start with a to. Always, always, always start with a to. They immediately are followed by an unconjugated verb. So if you could, this is a trick that I use all the time. If you can rephrase something or stick an in order to in front of something, then you have an infinitival phrase. So to catch a fish, you need a net. In order to catch a fish, you need a net. You need a net in order to catch a fish. We're seeing again that these, like the participial phrases, can come before or after the independent clause. And they're a little different in that they're always only followed by a comma. They're never preceded by a comma. You see that in these examples here. So again, the infinitival phrase tells us something about the subject of the independent clause. This is how we tie things together. We tie them together not only with grammatical elements, but also meaning-wise. And with these sentence modifiers, they've got to be all relevant to the meaning in the independent clause. Here's an example that shows that. To train and equip several thousand volunteers to be ready to respond when, not if, the worst happens. Well, that's an infinitival phrase. Mustafa Elvan Kantakin leads efforts in Istanbul's crowded working class and poor neighborhoods. So Mustafa Elvan Kantakin is the one doing the training and equipping. If someone else was, this sentence wouldn't make sense. We assume that it's the subject of the independent clause. So they can come after a verb or a clause too. And here's an example. I'll give you a minute to look at it. And here's another one. See, we see it after the verb phrase was spent to add. We can again add the in order to, was spent in order to add reinforced words and in order to make adjustments. So this is a pretty good test, this in order to thing. If it doesn't make sense, you're not in the right place. You're not identifying an infinitival phrase. All right, take a deep breath. This is the final kind of sentence modifier that we're looking at here. We've already seen adverbial conjunctions, which can be used to join independent clauses. Those are the things like, I like fish, however, I like beef better. That would be an adverbial conjunction. Adverbial phrases start with the same word. So wherever you saw the adverbial conjunctions in your textbook, you'll find the words on that list count for this as well. They add nuance to an independent clause. So we see now, remember when David Paterson was governor of New York? These sentences were taken before the election that put Andrew Cuomo in the governor's position. Mr. Paterson faced tougher criticism from those outside his circle of allies, independent clause, especially from Democratic members of Congress who anticipate difficult campaigns, etc., etc. Apparently, Paterson was still running. There you go, that's a long time ago. So this especially is an adverb. It gives us more sort of, I guess, it highlights one aspect of what we're looking at. Let's look at the second example. Nowadays, these therapists are just as focused on helping children without obvious disabilities to hold a pencil. So nowadays is an adverb because it gives nuance to the independent clause. It tells you sort of when it's happening, but not using a prepositional phrase, which would be another way to locate it in time and space. So, two different kinds of examples. Okay, so to identify adverbs and adverbial phrases, we've got a process of elimination going for everything. First of all, we're identifying independent clauses. That's not on my list, but that's the first thing to do. Then you're looking at the chunk of text that modifies a sentence, so separated from the independent clause by a comma. An adverbial phrase starts with a word that isn't a participle or an infinitive, and I will add it starts with a word that isn't a subordinating conjunction. So adverbs also often, but not always, end in an ly, especially, usually, possibly, rarely, etc. Once again, and I say this a lot, I'm very dull, but your dictionary can be really helpful because of that little annotation after all the entries that tells you what part of speech it is. And if you don't find it, take the ly off, and then probably if you're using a big enough dictionary, you go through it and you'll see the adverb marked with an ly. So you look up rare, and then you find rarely, and that's the adverb. Okay, next thing to do. Quiz 5, identifying sentence modifiers. Get started on the practice markup exercise on the wiki. You have enough information now to do most of what we need. All that's left is the noun phrases. So good luck, and I'll see you for one more lecture this week that is to do with the content rather than how to do the assignment. And that will be about noun modifiers. All right, good. Bye.